The glass was cold against her spine. Sage Green's fingers clawed uselessly at the hand, crushing her windpipe, her vision already darkening at the edges. Jackson Martin's breath was hot against her face, his silver hair perfectly combed, even as he pinned her against the window 43 floors above Manhattan. "No one will believe you," he whispered, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Not your word against mine." The office was silent except for Sage's choked gasps. Below, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, people heading home to safety, to lives where their bosses didn't lock doors and corner them after hours. Her red blouse had torn at the shoulder during the struggle. Her dark hair hung loose from its professional bun, and Jackson's eyes held something she'd never seen before. Not desire, not even anger, just cold certainty that he would get away with this. Then the door exploded inward. The crack echoed like a gunshot through the empty 43rd floor. Jackson's head snapped toward the sound, his grip loosening just enough for Sage to drag in a desperate breath. Through her blurred vision, she saw a figure filling the doorway, broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored black suit that couldn't hide the violence written into every line of his body. Neck tattoos crawled above his collar, silver chains caught the office lights, and his eyes, cold and calculating, swept the scene in less than a second. Romeo Perez stood perfectly still, his tattooed hands relaxed at his sides, but Sage recognized the tension in his jaw, the way his knuckles had gone white. This wasn't a man preparing to negotiate. This was a predator deciding which bones to break first. What happened next would shatter Jackson Martin's carefully constructed world of power and privilege. It would reveal that some predators only understand one language: overwhelming force delivered by someone who operates outside every rule they've always hidden behind. Stay with me until the end, because what Romeo Perez does to protect this woman will rewrite every assumption about justice, violence, and the razor-thin line between monster and savior. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. 3 minutes earlier, 3 floors below Jackson Martin's executive suite, Romeo Perez sat behind a desk that cost more than most people's cars. The office looked legitimate modern furniture, framed import licenses, potted plants that someone actually watered. 4 men occupied the leather chairs across from him, their expensive suits doing nothing to hide what they really were. "The West Side Territory is bleeding money," Marcus, his longest-serving lieutenant, was saying. "Delgado's crew keeps pushing into our distribution zones. We need to send a message before." "The message has already been sent," Romeo interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made men twice his size shut their mouths. "Delgado received a very clear conversation yesterday about respecting boundaries. He won't be a problem anymore." Romeo's neck tattoos crawled above his collar despite his efforts to appear respectable. At 38, he'd built an empire that existed in 2 worlds simultaneously. Perez import, export, filed taxes, and employed accountants. But everyone in this room understood that the real business happened in spaces the IRS would never audit. "What about the shipment coming through Newark?" Another lieutenant leaned forward. "The schedule got moved up. We're talking about significant exposure if..." A sound cut through the air conditioning hum. Faint, barely audible, filtering down through the building's ventilation system. Romeo's hand went still on his desk, his entire body tensing like a predator catching scent. There it was again. A muffled scream with a specific quality that made his blood run cold. Not surprise, not anger, but the desperate terror of someone who knew they were trapped with no escape. "Boss?" Marcus noticed the shift immediately. "What is it?" Romeo stood without answering, his chair rolling back silently on the expensive carpet. Every man in the room recognized that expression. They'd seen it before. Right before Romeo made decisions that changed everything. "Continue the meeting," Romeo said, already moving toward the door. But Romeo was already in the hallway, his instincts overriding every business protocol, every strategic calculation, every reasonable voice suggesting this wasn't his concern. He'd learned to trust that sound. Years ago, that specific pitch of fear meant someone defenseless was being hurt by someone who thought they had all the power. Romeo Perez had built his reputation on two absolutes: ruthless efficiency in business and merciless protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. Men who violated women or brutalized children didn't get warnings in Romeo's world. They got educated about consequences. His dress shoes echoed against the stairwell concrete as he climbed. 40 floors. 41. The sound had come from above, which meant Martin Financial Group's executive suites. Romeo knew Jackson Martin by reputation, connected, respected. The kind of legitimate businessman who looked down on men like Romeo. 42 floors. That scream came again. Weaker this time. Almost extinguished. Romeo took the last flight at a run. The executive floor was dark except for one office, at the end of the hallway. Light spilled from beneath a closed door. He could hear movement inside, labored breathing. A male voice too low to make out words. And underneath it all, that same desperate fear that had pulled him from his meeting. Romeo didn't knock, didn't announce himself, didn't give whoever was inside time to adjust or hide or claim this was a misunderstanding. He simply kicked the door open with enough force to splinter the frame. Romeo's mind calculated risks with every step he climbed. Every second he spent investigating a sound that might be nothing was a second his organization operated without direction. Marcus would make decisions in his absence. The Newark shipment still needed coordination. Territory disputes didn't pause for instincts, but that scream wouldn't leave his head. His hand gripped the stairwell railing, knuckles white against the metal. 43 floors in a building, full of cameras, full of witnesses, full of legitimate businesses that would remember seeing him here. If this turned into something complicated, if police got involved, if questions got asked, his carefully constructed separation between legal operations and everything else could collapse. Romeo pushed through the 43rd floor door anyway. The hallway stretched empty and dark, except for one office at the far end. Light spilled from beneath a closed door. Romeo moved toward it with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that hesitation got people killed. Not him. Never him. But the people he was supposed to protect. Her name had been Sophia. 13 years old. Romeo had been younger then, less powerful, still learning that respect in his world came through demonstrated consequences rather than inherited authority. She'd lived 2 buildings down from his grandmother's apartment. A quiet girl who smiled when she saw him, who asked about his day, like his answer actually mattered. The men who took her had assumed no one would care about another missing girl from their neighborhood. They'd been wrong. By the time Romeo found her, 3 days had passed. 3 days, too long. She'd survived. But something in her eyes had died that Romeo couldn't resurrect, no matter how thoroughly he'd made those men pay for what they'd done. He'd made himself a promise, standing in that hospital room, watching Sophia stare at nothing. He would never ignore that sound again, never assume someone else would intervene, never let calculation override the instinct that screamed when someone defenseless was suffering. If you've ever carried a promise born from pain, subscribe and stay with us because the price of keeping that promise is about to get brutal. The door was locked. Romeo tested the handle once, confirming what he already knew. Through the gap beneath the door, he could see shadows moving, could hear muffled sounds that made his jaw clench. A man's voice, low and threatening, labored breathing. The unmistakable sounds of a struggle. Every strategic bone in Romeo's body said to call building security. Let legitimate authorities handle whatever was happening behind that locked door. maintain his distance, protect his operations. Romeo took one step back, measuring the door's construction, calculating the force needed. Then he drove his heel into the wood just beside the lock with every ounce of controlled violence he'd spent 2 decades perfecting. The door exploded inward with a crack that echoed through the empty floor like a gunshot. The office materialized in Romeo's vision like a photograph developing in real time. Floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the Manhattan skyline. A woman in red pressed against the glass, her dark hair disheveled, her face showing the beginning of bruises, and Jackson Martin's silver hair perfectly styled despite the chaos. Expensive suit rumpled from struggle with his hand wrapped around her throat. Jackson's head snapped toward the destroyed doorway. His eyes went wide with shock that quickly tried to morph into indignation. The woman's gaze found Romeo through the haze of oxygen deprivation, and something in her expression shattered whatever remaining calculation existed in his mind. Romeo moved. He crossed the office with lethal efficiency, each step measured and purposeful. Jackson's hand was still on the woman's throat when Romeo reached them, still maintaining that possessive grip that assumed ownership, assumed authority, assumed no one would dare intervene. Romeo grabbed Jackson's wrist with both hands and twisted. The crack was audible. Jackson's grip released immediately as his body followed the momentum Romeo created, stumbling backward. Romeo didn't give him time to find balance. He seized the executive by his designer tie and hurled him across his own mahogany desk. Papers scattered. A laptop crashed to the floor. Jackson's body hit the opposite side, with enough force to send his desk chair rolling into the wall. The executive lay sprawled on his own expensive carpet, gasping, his face flushed with pain and disbelief. The woman slid down the glass window, her legs finally giving out. Her eyes fixed on Romeo, like she wasn't entirely sure whether he represented salvation or a different kind of danger. Jackson scrambled to his feet, one hand cradling his twisted wrist. His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the fear beneath his attempted authority. "I'll have you arrested. You just committed breaking and entering. Assault. This is private property." Romeo said nothing. He simply stood between Jackson and the woman, his tattooed hands relaxed at his sides, his expression utterly calm. The silence was more devastating than any threat could have been. "I have lawyers," Jackson continued, his voice rising as Romeo's quiet persisted. "I have connections. The police commissioner plays golf at my club. You're finished. You're crescent." Romeo took one step forward. Jackson stopped talking immediately, his mouth still open on whatever threat he'd been manufacturing, because Romeo's eyes carried something the executive had never encountered in his carefully insulated world of power lunches and negotiated settlements. Not anger, not rage, just cold, absolute certainty about what happened to men who put their hands on defenseless women. The room's entire dynamic had transformed. Jackson Martin was no longer the predator in his own domain. He was prey who'd just realized the apex predator had entered his territory. And Romeo Perez hadn't even spoken yet. "Do you know who I am?" Jackson's voice gained strength as Romeo's continued silence stretched. "I'm a senior executive at Martin Financial Group. I have lawyers on retainer who've never lost a case. I have connections that reach into every level of this city's power structure." He straightened his rumpled suit with his good hand, trying to reclaim the authority that had scattered across his office floor. "You just committed breaking and entering, assault on private property. I'll have you in prison before. I know exactly who you are, Jackson." Romeo's voice cut through the executive's escalating threats like a blade through silk. Low, calm, carrying weight that had nothing to do with volume. "You're the kind of man who preys on employees who can't fight back, who uses their desperation as leverage, who locks doors and assumes no one will ever make you answer for what happens behind them." Jackson's face went pale. "You don't understand the situation here. This is a private matter between, and I'm the kind of man who handles predators. Romeo took another step forward, and Jackson stumbled backward against his desk. The kind who understands that men like you only operate because you've never faced real consequences. You've hidden behind lawyers and connections, and the assumption that power means safety. From her position against the window, Sage watched the exchange with eyes that had cleared from their earlier panic. She could see Romeo's tattoos snaking above his collar, the knuckle scars on his hands, the expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the violence written into his posture. This man was dangerous in ways Jackson Martin had never imagined being dangerous, but Sage recognized something Jackson couldn't. Romeo's danger pointed in a specific direction. It wasn't the indiscriminate cruelty of a man who hurt whoever was convenient. It was the focused precision of someone who'd chosen his targets carefully. You can't just break into my office and threaten me. Jackson tried again, though his voice had lost its earlier conviction. Whatever you think, you saw. I saw exactly what I saw. Romeo's eyes flicked briefly to Sage, his expression softening almost imperceptibly before returning to Jackson with renewed coldness. Your hand on her throat, her back against that window. The locked door. The empty floor. You planned this, didn't you? Waited until everyone went home. Made sure she stayed late. Created the perfect circumstances where it would be her word against yours. Jackson's silence was confirmation enough. Here's what you miscalculated, Romeo continued, his voice dropping even lower. You assumed your power was the only power that mattered in this building. You forgot that some of us operate in spaces your lawyers can't reach. Some of us enforce rules your connections can't protect you from. Sage's hands had stopped trembling. She pulled herself upright against the window, her eyes moving between the two men. Romeo's back was to her, but she could see Jackson's face, the dawning realization that he'd finally encountered someone his money and influence couldn't intimidate. What do you want? Jackson whispered. Romeo smiled. It held no warmth whatsoever. Jackson's eyes darted to Sage, then back to Romeo, and something shifted in his expression. Desperation bred cunning. You think you can just walk in here and play hero? You don't understand the situation. His voice gained confidence as he found his leverage. She needs this job. She can't afford to lose it. Romeo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her younger sister is in treatment at Mount Sinai. Jackson continued, warming to his theme now that he'd found footing. Stage 3 cancer. The experimental therapy alone costs $15,000 a month. And that's before you factor in the standard treatments, the hospital stays, the medications. He straightened slightly, his twisted wrist forgotten in his rush to reclaim control. I know exactly how much debt Sage is carrying. I know she's 3 months behind on payments. I know her sister's insurance coverage expires in 6 weeks. Sage's face had gone white. Romeo noticed her hands clench against the window behind her. So here's what's actually happening. Jackson pressed on, his executive arrogance resurging. Whatever you think you saw tonight is a misunderstanding that will disappear the moment you walk out that door. Because if Sage says one word to you, to police, to anyone, I'll make sure she's terminated for cause. Sexual harassment of a superior. I have emails I can produce. Witnesses I can call. A pattern of inappropriate behavior I've been documenting for months. Romeo's expression hadn't changed. But something in the air grew colder. She'll never work in finance again, Jackson continued. Not in this city. Not anywhere my reach extends. And without this job, without this salary, her sister's treatment stops. Do you understand what I'm telling you? If she talks, her sister dies. The silence that followed lasted 3 heartbeats. In the comments below, tell me, what is the one single thing you think Romeo Perez should do to Jackson right now to make him pay for weaponizing a child's illness? Let me know, and we'll see if you're right. You're using her sister as leverage. Romeo's voice was quieter than before, which somehow made it more threatening. You found the one thing she loves more than her own safety, and turned it into a weapon against her. I'm explaining reality, Jackson corrected. She made choices that put her in this position. I've seen this before. Romeo's words cut through Jackson's rationalization. This exact tactic. Men in my organization who targeted family members to ensure compliance, who found the vulnerable pressure points and exploited them. He took another step. Closer. You know what happened to those men, Jackson. Jackson's newfound confidence wavered. They learned that some rules exist outside your lawyer's understanding, Romeo said. That some consequences can't be negotiated away with severance packages and non-disclosure agreements. Romeo's fury had transformed into something far more dangerous than anger. This wasn't about stopping one act of violence anymore. This was about dismantling an entire system of exploitation that Jackson had carefully constructed. This was about making sure a predator who weaponized desperation would never hunt again. Let me tell you what's actually going to happen, Romeo said, pulling out his phone. Romeo's phone screen illuminated his face as his fingers moved across it with practiced efficiency. You're going to resign from Martin Financial Group. Effective immediately. You'll transfer 6 months of Sage's current salary into her account as severance. Call it whatever you want in the paperwork. Bonus, settlement, doesn't matter. Then you're leaving Manhattan, permanently. Jackson laughed, though it sounded forced. Or what? You'll kill me? Right here? In my own office? With cameras in every hallway? With your fingerprints on my door? His confidence was rebuilding brick by brick. You're not thinking clearly. One phone call, and this building is swarming with police. You'll be arrested before you reach the lobby. I'm not going to kill you, Jackson. Romeo turned his phone around, showing the screen to the executive. I'm going to let you choose your own ending. The blood drained from Jackson's face as he stared at the footage. His office, from multiple angles. High-definition video showing him backing Sage against the window, his hand closing around her throat, her desperate struggle. The timestamp read, 8:34 p.m., 20 minutes ago. That's impossible, Jackson whispered. This building's security system is encrypted. The feeds are stored on secure servers that my people accessed about 15 minutes ago. Romeo pocketed his phone, along with some other interesting files on Martin Financial Group's internal servers, client accounts with unusual offshore transfers, insider trading patterns that the SEC would find fascinating, tax documents that don't quite match what you filed with the IRS. Jackson's face went from white to gray. You're bluffing. You couldn't have. I run an import-export business 3 floors below you, Romeo interrupted. You think I don't have people who understand digital security? Who can move through systems your IT department doesn't even know exist? He leaned against Jackson's desk with casual confidence. The question isn't whether I have this information. The question is, what happens to it? This is extortion, Jackson said, but his voice had lost all its authority. This is education. Romeo's tone remained conversational, almost friendly, which made it more threatening. You're not facing legal consequences, Martin. You're choosing between degrees of destruction. Option 1. You resign quietly, pay Sage what she's owed, and disappear from Manhattan. The security footage stays private. The financial irregularities stay undiscovered. You lose your job and your city, but you keep your freedom. Jackson's breathing had become shallow. Option 2. You fight this. You call your lawyers, threaten Sage, try to use your connections to make me disappear. And every federal agency that handles white-collar crime receives detailed documentation of Martin Financial Group's creative accounting practices. Along with that security footage, which will be time-stamped, verified, and completely inadmissible in court because of how it was obtained, but perfect for destroying your reputation in every professional circle you've ever touched. Romeo straightened. You're not choosing between winning and losing, Jackson. You're choosing how much you lose, and how publicly. Jackson's knees buckled. He caught himself against the desk, his good hand gripping the mahogany edge until his knuckles went white. All the calculations that had governed his life, risk versus reward, leverage versus exposure, power versus consequence, had been built on a foundation that assumed the rules he knew were the only rules that mattered. Romeo Perez operated by different rules entirely. How long do I have? Jackson's voice came out hoarse, defeated. 48 hours to submit your resignation. 72 for the money transfer to clear. Romeo's tone remained businesslike, as if they were negotiating a standard contract rather than the complete dismantling of Jackson's life. After that, you have 1 week to be out of Manhattan. I'll know if you're not. Jackson nodded slowly, a broken marionette whose strings had finally been cut. He slumped into his desk chair, cradling his twisted wrist, staring at nothing. The predator who'd ruled this office through intimidation and exploitation had been reduced to a man contemplating the wreckage of his own carefully constructed empire. Romeo turned away from him, dismissing Jackson as if he'd already ceased to exist. His attention shifted to Sage, and everything about his posture changed. The controlled violence that had radiated from him moments before softened into something approaching gentleness. Are you hurt? His voice was completely different now, low, careful, stripped of the cold authority he'd used on Jackson. Do you need medical attention? Sage shook her head, though her hands still trembled against the glass window behind her. I'm okay. He didn't. She couldn't finish the sentence. You don't have to explain anything to me. Romeo kept his distance, making no move to approach her without permission. I need to know if you're injured, if you need a doctor, if there's somewhere safe you can go tonight. My sister, Sage whispered. He knows about my sister. If he won't. Romeo's certainty was absolute. Jackson Martin is no longer a threat to you or anyone you care about. That's a promise. Given it, Sage's composure, which had held through 6 months of harassment and escalating threats, through being cornered and attacked, through watching her boss physically thrown across his own office, that composure finally shattered, not from fear, not from trauma, but from the overwhelming relief of someone who'd been fighting alone for so long, finally hearing someone say, I believe you, and I'll make sure you're safe. The tears came suddenly, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She slid down the window again, but this time not from terror. This time from the weight of months of accumulated fear and desperation finally finding an outlet. Romeo didn't move toward her, didn't try to comfort her with unwanted touch or meaningless reassurances. He simply stood between her and Jackson's broken form, a physical barrier, ensuring she was safe while she processed everything that had happened. Take your time, he said quietly. We're not leaving until you're ready. Jackson's head lifted from his hands, and something desperate flickered across his face. His voice cracked, but venom leaked through the fractures. I'll destroy her. I'll tell everyone she seduced me, that she initiated everything. I'll make sure every firm in this city knows exactly what kind of employee she is. She'll never work in finance again. Never work anywhere respectable. Romeo was silent for 3 long seconds, studying Jackson with the clinical detachment of someone examining an insect. When he finally spoke, his tone carried no anger, no threat, just the calm certainty of someone delivering educational information. Let me explain what happens to men like you in my world, Jackson. Not as a threat, Just so you understand the landscape you're entering if you make that choice. Romeo leaned against the desk. Men who weaponize reputation, who build systems to silence their victims, who assume their word, carries more weight because of their position. Those men tend to discover that reputation is fragile, that systems can be dismantled, that positions can be stripped away. Jackson's face had gone pale again. More specifically, Romeo continued, every woman you've ever harassed, every employee you've ever exploited, every victim you assumed would stay silent because they needed their paychecks, they all start getting phone calls. Anonymous, untraceable calls, informing them that others have come forward. That they're not alone. That a lawyer has offered to represent them pro bono in a class action suit. Romeo pulled out his phone again. And the security footage? It doesn't just show tonight. My people found archived files going back 3 years. Different women, different offices, same pattern. The criminal case might be complicated. But civil suits? Those are much easier to prove. Node, you're insane. Jackson whispered. I'm thorough. Romeo gestured to the desk. There's paper in your drawer. Write your resignation. Date it today. Sign it. Then we're done here. And if I refuse? Then federal investigators receive their anonymous tip at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Your alleged victims receive their phone calls by noon, and the security footage gets distributed to every major media outlet by evening. Romeo's tone remained conversational. Your choice. Make it now. Jackson's hands shook as he pulled out a sheet of company letterhead. The pen scratched against paper. Each word, a surrender. When he finished, Romeo photographed the letter with his phone before Jackson could change his mind. Romeo turned back to Sage, his expression shifting again to something gentler. He pulled a business card from his jacket and set it on the corner of the desk. Perez, import, export. We have an accounting position open. Better pay than here. Better benefits. Your sister's medical bills will be covered through the company insurance, starting whenever you accept the position. He paused. This is genuine employment, not charity, and it's entirely your choice. Sage stared at the card, then at Romeo. Why? Because no one should have to choose between safety and survival, Romeo said simply. Take the weekend. Think about it. Call that number when you're ready. Sage stared at the card, then at Romeo. Why? Because no one should have to choose between safety and survival, Romeo said simply. What an incredible act of protection. Do you think Sage should accept the job? Knowing who Romeo is, let me know in the comments below. Then we'll find out what she decides. 6 weeks later, Sage Green sat at a desk on the 40th floor of the same building, 3 floors below where her nightmare had ended. The office looked nothing like Martin Financial Group's sterile executive suites. Plants grew in actual sunlight. Colleagues said good morning without calculation behind their eyes. And when she stayed late to finish a project, no one locked doors or made her feel like prey. The accounting work was legitimate import duties, customs documentation, shipping manifests that actually matched what moved through ports. Romeo's legal operations were cleaner than most Fortune 500 companies she'd audited. If the man ran illegal enterprises alongside his legitimate business, he kept them separated with surgical precision. Jackson Martin had resigned exactly 43 hours after Romeo's ultimatum. The official statement cited personal reasons and pursuing new opportunities. But 2 weeks later, federal investigators had announced an inquiry into Martin Financial Group's trading practices. 3 weeks after that, 5 other women had come forward with harassment complaints spanning 7 years. The criminal charges were still pending. But Jackson's reputation had been incinerated so thoroughly that even his expensive lawyers couldn't reconstruct it. Sage heard these developments through news alerts on her phone, each notification a small confirmation that monsters could actually face consequences. Romeo appeared in her office doorway holding an envelope. "This came for you." He set it on her desk. "Well, technically it came addressed to the man who helped my sister. But I figured you should see it." The handwriting was careful, practiced a teenager's careful script. Sage opened it and found a thank you card covered in stickers of butterflies and flowers. The message inside was simple. "Dear Mr. Perez, my sister Sage says you helped her when she was in trouble. I don't know exactly what happened, but I know she's not scared anymore. She smiles again. Thank you for giving me my sister back. Also, thank you for the insurance that's helping me get better. I'm going to beat this cancer and become a doctor so I can help other people like you helped us." Sage's throat tightened. She doesn't know. She doesn't need to know. Romeo leaned against the doorframe. Some things are better kept between the people who lived them. Later, after Sage had gone home, Romeo sat alone in his office. He opened his desk drawer and placed Maya's card next to a faded photograph of a 13-year-old girl with dark eyes and a smile that had died years before her body did. Sophia, the reason he'd built his protective code, the reminder of what happened when he hesitated, when he calculated risks instead of acting on instincts. Maya's card lay next to Sophia's photograph like a balance sheet. One life he couldn't save. One he could. Sage understood what he was, had seen him at his most violent, knew the darkness he carried, recognized the criminal empire he maintained alongside legitimate business. And Romeo understood what she was, had witnessed her courage, seen her refuse to break under months of exploitation, knew the strength it took to rebuild after trauma. Their relationship remained professional. No emotional entanglement, no complicated dynamics, just mutual respect between two people who'd survived different versions of hell and chose to keep fighting anyway. Hit subscribe if you'd kick down the door for someone who couldn't save themselves. Comment where you're from. Sometimes the most ruthless men were forged in the fires of witnessing suffering they couldn't prevent, and sometimes choosing to be a monster to other monsters was its own form of salvation. Imperfect, complicated, but undeniably real.